Hi, I am Laura Eid, and I am the director and main author of Latin Through Stories. And language teaching and learning are my passion, so I'm really excited to share some of that with you today and to help you get started with Latin Through Stories. So I would like to get started with two guiding principles for our curriculum, and then we will go through all of the components and also talk about how to adjust the curriculum to different grade levels. And finally, we'll briefly talk about vocabulary lists and quizzes. So I just wanted to briefly touch on two of our main guiding principles in creating this curriculum. And the first concerns our reason and goals for learning Latin. Now, today, schools and curricula often emphasize the usefulness of Latin by listing things like increasing students' English grammar, English vocabulary, improving their SAT scores, and even things like general mental agility, logic training. I think it is safe to say that this probably wouldn't have occurred to most educators in previous centuries. Now, I'm not saying that these are invalid or that they don't happen. They certainly do, but I think in the classical tradition, these would be considered more like welcome side effects, but not end goals, main reasons for studying Latin. In the classical tradition, students learned to speak, read, write, and interact in Latin by going through the entire trivium in Latin: grammar, logic, dialectic, and rhetoric. And the final goal was for them to be able to participate in the ongoing great conversation that's been taking place in Latin for over 2 millennia, and for them to be able to use the language in their further studies. So when little Isaac Newton went to school in the late 1600s, his teacher's goals for his students clearly included being able to express themselves in Latin with fluency, ease, and accuracy. And I always find it fascinating to consider that Newton lived and wrote in Latin over 1,200 years after the fall of Rome, and like many educated people of that time, was still able to compose and think in Latin fluently, accurately, and with ease. Now, our little Newtons of today don't really need to compose their scientific findings in Latin anymore or write their dissertations in Latin. So our goal is not for your students to write another Principia Mathematica, but at least to be able to participate in the great conversation in Latin by being able to interact with texts in Latin, thinking, reading, speaking about them in Latin. In order to achieve that, we need to expose students to a lot of Latin early on. So that brings me to our second main guiding principle, which is the idea of both high quantity and high quality input. In the early stages, input will be mostly what students hear, and later on, it will include reading the language as well. So input, first of all, needs to be comprehensible. So students need to be able to understand what they're hearing or reading. And ideally, comprehension is established through pictures and gestures rather than through translation, because that establishes a much more direct link between the Latin word and the idea or thing that it expresses. Of course, it's totally fine to use translation here and there if you feel like that's absolutely necessary, but as much as possible, try to focus on conveying meaning through gestures and pictures. Input also needs to be compelling and relevant to the learner, so students need to be interested in the messages that they hear or read. And that is why we're focusing on animals in level 1, because that is a topic that young children usually like to talk and learn about. We also try to provide really rich input, a lot of language, and that means that students are going to be exposed to a lot more language than they can really actively absorb and internalize and acquire in one lesson. But all of that language is going into their unconscious minds for gradual processing and gradual acquisition when they've been exposed to those words and structures enough times. And what exactly constitutes enough times really varies from student to student, just like first language acquisition also varies greatly from one child to the next. So that is why we really want to try and fill each lesson as much as possible with Latin so that all children have the chance to absorb as much language as possible. And that is why we need to really make sure that the language is always available abundantly, that we repeat things often enough, frequently enough, and really fill the lesson with Latin. And lastly, this is especially important for very young students, output shouldn't be forced. Just like, again, we didn't ask our 1 or 2-year-olds to always speak in full sentences. Please give your students sufficient time in acquiring the language, becoming familiar with its sounds and structures, and allow the language to emerge naturally. When children are ready to speak, they will speak. So I would like to briefly go through the curriculum components just to give you a bit of an overview of what they are all about. So we always start with a settling into Latin element. We have sometimes picture studies that introduce a new topic, a new animal, a new habitat. The Google series are repeated in every lesson, and different ones are reviewed. Then a little Socratic talk usually comes with a PowerPoint, but can also, at least the beginning ones, can be done with just puppets or stuffed animals. Then we have the stories for the little Socratic reading, and optional grammar extensions for 3rd grade and up. And the idea of course, all of this is not going to be in one lesson. There are different components throughout, but the main idea here is that we want to give students an abundant feast, like Charlotte Mason said, so that they can absorb as much as possible and be immersed in the language as much as possible. And like I said, each little guest is going to take in what they can, and for some this is going to happen faster, for others slower, but it will happen for all of them if you just provide this linguistic feast for them. So the settling into Latin stage is mostly a review stage, and a stage where we have a lot of repetition of and review of materials. There are some optional prayers and Bible verses and hymns, and then we have some songs and nursery rhymes, and Google series that have been memorized already are reviewed throughout in that settling into Latin phase as part of your warm-up, basically. It can be helpful to try and memorize some of the things that you teach beforehand, like some of the songs beforehand, for introducing a new song. But please don't worry about just learning along with students. You don't have to have things fully memorized and know them perfectly in order to teach them. Just be willing to learn along with your students and be willing to have that sheet in front of you or play the recording and sing along. Just learning along with students is perfectly fine. I really want to emphasize to please always have students do, especially in this phase, but in other curriculum phases too, allow choral recitations. Don't make students do this individually. Make this a whole class exercise so that everyone is involved, everyone is engaged, everyone is making gestures, either speaking along or even just making gestures. That's really, especially with the little ones, that's perfectly fine if they're just acting it out, making the gestures with you and not fully speaking along. Again, allow that to happen gradually. It can also be really helpful to have students get up for these so that they get out of their seats a little bit, can get a little bit more relaxed, and really the idea is for them to settle into Latin, to be happy in the Latin language. And even once they have memorized a song or a nursery rhyme and you're just reviewing it, still speak or sing along with them so that you can still model good pronunciation, that you can still model especially the endings, pronounce the endings clearly, so that we can increase a student's fluency and accuracy. And so here's just a very quick example of what this layout will look like, and if you've looked at the curriculum already, you've seen this. So just real quick, the prayers and the Bible verses are always optional. And so the part 1 could be just left out if you aren't doing this. And then in part 2, we have one song that's always kind of a warm-up song where you always have the same thing, or we're just varying between a few new songs, so that this is something that really helps students settle into Latin and just feel familiar with it, not start with something brand new. And just for some variety, you might do a Grand Series review next, and then another song, the nursery rhymes here. There might be one that you are reviewing, and then one that you're either introducing new or where you're adding new stanzas. With the really little ones, it could be helpful to have a nursery rhyme book with beautiful illustrations. We do have some illustrations on the website of the ones that we use, so this is not entirely necessary, but these have some really beautiful illustrations. So I just wanted to mention these. The picture study, like I said, is often used to introduce a new animal or sometimes a new habitat, and the script always has what you say, and then a translation and some ideas for gestures, and then what the suggested students' responses would be. So when you do this with your students, you can really just read out the left side column. You might practice this beforehand once if you like. And I would recommend that you try and follow the script as closely as possible, and that you also encourage your students to really listen to what you're saying and to watch you, so using the pictures, pointing to things in the picture. As you notice here, we're asking the question, quod canes in pictura sunt? Now, when students hear that question, they don't yet know what it means. But we want to help them figure it out rather than giving them the translation right away. So we demonstrate what it means by saying unos, duo, tres, quatuor, and then we repeat the question, quod canes sunt? So by repeating that question, by demonstrating that you're counting the dogs in the picture, you demonstrate what that question means. You might then clarify in English to make sure that really everyone is clear on what it means. But it's very helpful to not give a translation right away, so that students get used to trying to figure things out on their own, or processing the Latin as Latin by looking at what you do and what the picture is showing. So the purpose here is to either review or introduce vocabulary, but also grammatical structure. So since we're speaking to them in complete sentences, there's always grammar involved. Every sentence has grammar. And again, please try to use gestures abundantly and use the images to point to particular parts that are relevant to what you're saying. You don't have to finish a script completely if you feel like your students are maybe losing interest, or if you have really little ones, you might just cut it off, or if it just goes slow, cut it off. That is perfectly fine. The main thing is to try and do as much as you can, but you also don't want to make it drag on too long. And once again, let students respond chorally every time they respond in Latin. Most of these responses are short and simple anyway, like yes, no, or dog, or boy. The website has all of the links to the artworks, and there's also a zip file that lets you download all of the works in one go, including some that are slightly edited, like this one. The original is kind of dark, so we've made this a little bit brighter so that it's a bit easier to see how many dogs exactly are there. And then let's move on to the Gouin series. A Gouin series is basically a series of 7 to 10, usually like 7 or 8, sentences that form kind of a sequence or a logical, chronological series of events. And the idea is for students to, by and by, fully memorize the series by acting it out and saying it along with you. And once again, when you first introduce it, you don't have to have it fully memorized yourself. It's perfectly fine if you read along and just memorize it along with your students. We strongly recommend for this to use stuffed animals. We also have some image props on the website that you can use, but really the physical items would be highly recommended, especially with little ones. The curriculum is already somewhat image heavy, so it's also helpful to not have so many images all the time and to just have the interaction and the physical items, especially since you can pass these on to different students once you've learned this a little bit. So the idea here is that language should always be learned at the sentence level, that meaning is being processed at the sentence level, not at the isolated word level. And Mr. Guan really emphasized that the mind remembers things much better if they are presented, if ideas are presented in a logical sequence, if they're not just random sentences that illustrate a grammatical point, for example, but sentences that form kind of a mini story, a little sequence that is a story. Charlotte Mason, too, really liked the Guan series method, and I really like this quote here: "A language learned by Mr. Guan's method is a liberal education in itself. You really learn to think in the new language. You order your thoughts in the new language, and having done so, the words which express these are an inalienable possession." So that is really also our goal, to make students really fully absorb the language, to make it their own, and to really internalize the vocabulary as well as the grammar. Each Guan series is typically spread out over 6 lessons, some variation, but mostly 6 lessons. And the most important thing to remember is that at first it is really input. We gradually move from input to output. So in the first class, students aren't going to be doing much speaking in the first introduction. They will be acting, making some gestures with you, but you will be saying, either reading or saying it to your students, acting it out. And just gradually over the course of the 6 lessons, students will by and by be able to say more, speak along with you. And even if at the end of it they haven't fully memorized it, that's perfectly fine, as long as they're able to speak along with you, make the gesture, know what it says. And with the really little ones, again, if they aren't speaking along, if they're just making the gesture, if they know exactly what you're saying, that is really, really good. That is perfectly fine and sufficient. So do make sure that students are always acting it out, that there's always that connection between doing something and what it means in Latin. And then all of these Guan series are being repeated throughout the year, because really only language that you keep in your head, that remains in your memory, is language that you have acquired and that you can further develop. If you memorize something and then it goes out of your brain the next day, it's language, it's completely useless. And once again, let students do this all together as a group, chorally. You can have individual students come to the front to act it out if you're a classroom teacher, but still let the whole class make the gestures and speak along with you. So here's just an example of the frequency of review. So again, kind of a spaced repetition method here, where at first they are very frequent, and then there's more gap between each repetition, and the idea is really just to keep them in their brain. With 4th and 5th graders, you might give them the series to read along at some point too, because they should also be making the connection between what they're hearing and what they're reading. But it's really helpful to not do that right away, to let them also process the language orally and orally first, so that they're really paying attention to what you're saying, what the gestures are that go with that, processing the meaning, and also hopefully getting better pronunciation that way. Sometimes when new students just read something, it will come out sounding English, so that can be helpful to wait a few days with that. The Guan series are also very often the basis for explicit grammatical components. So we maybe take some sentences to analyze, and maybe find the subject or the verbs. So that is also something that you can, where you can make some adjustments and have fewer repetitions, fewer reviews, but move into a grammatical analysis at some point. And we often give you all of the sentences with annotations. That doesn't mean that you have to do them all, especially with the little ones. Just one sentence is fine. They don't have to analyze all of them. Really just have them start getting used to the idea of analyzing sentences, and you can increase the number by and by. You can also have students create a mini booklet where they illustrate the series and either copy it, or you can use the printed version. I'll talk about that in a second. And then they can take it home and read it to siblings. That's also often very effective if they bring something home and show their parents and siblings. Okay, moving on to the Little Socratic Talks. The format here in the teacher guide is similar to the picture studies, where you have a list of what you say, and then the translation as well, some comments about gestures that you can make, and suggested student responses. And like I said, these come with a PowerPoint, so you really don't need the teacher guide here. You can just read off what's on the PowerPoint. The teacher guide is just there so that you have the translation, and if you are able to, for the very first few, it can be really helpful to use physical stuffed animals. You really just need a cat, a dog, and a mouse for the first few, so that you can have more direct interaction with students rather than you, the screen, and students. But the PowerPoint is there if you need it, because it is definitely easier to just read something off, and that's perfectly fine. But even if you're using the PowerPoint, try to still act things out and also encourage students to make those gestures. So when they respond with "Feliz dormit," they should be making a dormit gesture, or maybe even "Feliz dormit." How many gestures you make really depends on how comfortable you are with adding in the gestures, remembering the gestures and the Latin and all of the different elements. So it's fine to not make all of the gestures, but at least for verbs, that's really a crucial thing to do, to remember what the action is. The main purpose of the Little Socratic Talks are, of course, again, to provide lots of comprehensible input. Input is very comprehensible here because we have the pictures, and they are also, again, very easy to act out for the most part. They help you provide comprehensible input, and they are all designed to gradually progress from very simple yes-no questions to short answer questions to longer questions. So at first they're just going to say yes if you ask, is it a dog? Is this a dog? Yes. And then, is it a dog or a cat? A dog. And then maybe, what is the dog doing? But that comes gradually as they hear you say it multiple times first before they are expected to produce that word or sentence. Also, just as a quick note, on the PowerPoint, the answer appears on click if you download it. If you put it in a Google slide, it might not work, or on some computers it seems to not work so well. So just wanted you to be aware that the answer is not supposed to be there. It's supposed to appear on click. So if the answer is already there, then you might need to fiddle around with your computer a little bit to make that not happen, because students should definitely not see the answer before they've given it. And for the Little Socratic Talks, once again, let students respond chorally so that they're all engaged as much as possible. Sometimes with older students it might be helpful to call on individual students, but I would try out letting them all respond first. And the little ones, speak along with them. If you ask a question, give the answer and invite them to speak along with you. And again, have them make the gestures while giving the response. So they should always be saying and doing things at the same time. If the students are just giving short responses, you might give a completer response so that they get more input. So if they're just saying yes, you might say, yes, the cat is sleeping. Just again, to increase the amount of input that they receive. And then with older students, you can encourage more and longer responses gradually. So especially with the little ones, I would recommend not calling on individual students. With older students, that might be something that you need to try out. For the duration of the Little Socratic Talk, we would really recommend not translating what you're saying. Try to make this, at least this part of the lesson, kind of a full immersion experience where they see the picture, they hear and see the question, and they see your gestures, you're pointing to pictures. So it shouldn't be necessary to translate things unless you feel like it's really necessary here and there. When students respond and they're maybe not giving quite the right ending, or it wasn't quite the right word, just repeat back the correct answer and maybe invite everyone to repeat it along with you. And again, this should be kind of a mini immersion experience, so don't stop to explain things. Sometimes there is a grammar component after this, or you might, if you feel like there is none and then you want one, you could, after you finished it, you could point out a few things here and there. But make this somewhat fast-paced. If you stop too often to explain things, it drags on and then it doesn't become effective. And finally, we get to the little Socratic readings, and wanted to remind you again that really reading and engaging with ideas through reading, that is at the heart of a classical education. So that's really the most important thing. So sometimes people feel a bit overwhelmed by the idea of reading stories in Latin, especially if you're new to Latin. So I would like to encourage you to just try and hang in there and do your best, and again, learn along with the students, and don't worry about saying everything perfectly or about not being fluent in Latin. That's not the main point. The main point is to gradually increase your understanding and your fluency. So once again, our goal here is for students to be able to interact with ideas in Latin. So we need to expose them to complete, full ideas from the beginning, and to ideas in a longer story form than what we have in the other components. When you first read to your little ones, like maybe your 2, 3, 4-year-olds, chances are they didn't understand absolutely everything you read to them, but they still loved the story, they still wanted to hear it over and over, and gradually and by, they probably understood the story really well, they understood most of the language, they increased their vocabulary and their understanding of what English sentences are like, and they might even have memorized chunks of the language and maybe repeated it back in play, and that's really exactly our goals too. So I want you to remember that understanding is a gradual process. It comes from hearing the stories multiple times, and they're all scheduled to be read at least like around 7 times. So don't expect full comprehension on the first reading. Just let this happen gradually. In level 1, we start out with 5 fairly simple animal stories. Now, they do have a fair amount of text. There is a lot of text, but the text is very repetitive, so it's not, these are not difficult stories to comprehend because there's so much repetition there. So the same structures or words are being used over and over. And then we move on to 5 traditional folk tales that are retold in a simple language, and then there are a few optional additional ones that are not that are published by Bolshasy Kalichi publishers that you can purchase separately. These are stories that you can also use in between if you just want some more variety, especially the Ursus et Porcus and Taurus Rex. Those would go great with theme 2, which is about farm animals, so you could definitely use these earlier than theme 5. So once again, our main goals are to expose students to a language, to provide a lot of input. And the language here is going to be slightly beyond the students' current level, but not to the point where they can't understand. There are still pictures, there's still familiar context, they're easy to act out and demonstrate. The goal is to understand the Latin as Latin, not for students to translate. You can use translation to help comprehension here and there if you feel like there's a sentence that they can't understand or that you don't think they would understand unless you translate it, then that's fine. But that's not the end goal. They shouldn't be able to say what it means in English. They should come back to it, hear it again, comprehend it, and be able to respond, for example, through a gesture or by answering a question in Latin. The goal is to assimilate the language and to maybe even have students memorize some chunks of language that they can then, that really becomes part of their linguistic constitution. And that really helps them develop intuition, helps them develop a feel for what Latin is like, for what a Latin sentence is like, for what the language sounds like, which is how students develop their English. A few points about reading effectively. Try to make it as interactive as possible. So that means asking students to make gestures with you. There are suggestions in the teacher guide about making gestures, but also for questions, short answer questions that you can ask, kind of like with the little Socratic talks. So have students do something while you read to them. They shouldn't just be sitting there passively. And of course, try to read as expressively as possible with different voices for different characters, maybe even exaggeratedly. That can help get the point across or increase interest and engagement. Making it as dramatic as possible can be really helpful. Of course, always use the pictures that are provided in the stories to point to things, to show what's happening, but then also try to act out some of the things while reading it. And instead of asking students for a translation, always have them make a gesture to demonstrate that they understand what is happening. And like I said, it is totally fine to provide some translations if you think they are helpful or necessary. But that should really only happen on the first reading of a story, not on subsequent readings. The goal is to get away from thinking in English and into really just processing the Latin as Latin and understanding what it means upon hearing it. So that's why reading and rereading is really important. You shouldn't just read and comprehend a story once and then be done with it. The goal is to continue to interact with it, to really absorb, assimilate the language. And that's also why we provide readers' theater versions of most of the stories. So these are very similar to the stories themselves, just with sometimes simplification. And so these allow students to interact with the story in different ways. Now, with the really little ones, of course, students might not be reading yet, so they aren't going to be reading this themselves. But it is something where, if you feel brave enough to try that, you could do a little puppet play version of the story using the script, where you read the script and then the students are just acting it out, either with puppets or they are the characters themselves. So you can use the reader's theater even with the little ones. You don't have to make them speak. You can do all of the talking, or you can make them speak along with you, but it is also really fine for them to just hear it and act it out. That already provides so much input to them. And for the older ones to then either read along with you or start reading independently really skyrockets students' language acquisition, because they're interacting with the language in a different way. They're hearing it more often, but with some variation, and they're acting out what they're hearing or saying. So that's really very effective. And I just wanted to let you know that there is some more guidance and information on Reader's Theater on the website under the Supplementary Resources tab. I would like to talk about adjusting the lessons to different grade levels, because some of you might be teaching this to both kindergartners and fifth graders. So the most important thing is to adjust your expectations of what students will do. So for kindergartners, please focus on input, not on output, not on the student's production of the language. The main idea should be to just provide as much language as you can in the time that you have with them, so that they can absorb the language and make it their own. When little babies and toddlers learn a language, they first hear the language for at least a year until they start producing the first words. And if they don't start talking until they're 2 or 3, they have heard so much language. So we need to help students just be exposed to the language extensively in the early years. And students can be encouraged to speak along, make gestures, but again, production is not the main point at the kindergarten level. You might also, with the little ones, split the lessons in half and just do half of a lesson. If you do that, I would recommend that you still use an element from the settling into Latin phase in the second half of the lesson, so that they're always settling into Latin with something familiar, that you're not starting with like a new little Socratic talk, or introducing a new Gouin series. So always start with something familiar, but feel free to split lessons if you need to. In first grade, students could be encouraged to speak along and to respond in more independently with at least one-word response. And they should speak very comfortably along with you for all of the review materials, as well as, of course, making the gestures. Second and third graders can gradually progress toward more independent responses, toward full sentence responses, and they might also practice, depending on how they're reading in English, they might practice reading a reader's theater and at least being able to either read along or read individually their own lines. And with third grade and up, you can definitely start adding in some of the grammar extensions. I'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, with fourth and fifth grade, there should be a good balance of input and output. The input is still really crucial for language learners of all ages, so it shouldn't be all about output, but they can definitely be encouraged to produce more and completer responses. With those grades, I would recommend doing fewer reviews and repetition. They tend to get bored a little bit more easily with a review and repetition if it is too frequent. So instead of that, you might do some of the grammar extensions. You might do more of the reader's theater. So there are some ideas. I'll talk about that in a minute in some more detail. Now here, just to give you an idea of a general progression. So scenario A, one idea for where you have one level per year, but there are definitely other ways to do this. So if you're able to do a level a year, you would start in kindergarten with students really mostly for input, but also, I mean, encouraging them a little bit to speak along. In first grade, you might progress to level 2 through the year in Latin. And so here students might gradually be encouraged to memorize more elements or longer parts of, for example, a Grand series. And you might do some reader's theater versions of the stories. Again, like I was saying, that doesn't mean that the students need to be reading. They can just be acting it out as you read it, or maybe acting it out and speaking along with you some of it. And for both of these, you would not do any grammar extensions. And then in second grade, you might start with level 3, which is about fables. And so here, depending on how students are reading in English, they might practice reading some fables independently, might memorize the dialogue version perhaps. But again, you would not do grammar at this stage. That I really recommend waiting until third grade to integrate some grammar. Here's a possible scenario B where you would spread out the levels a little bit more. Like if you have fewer contact hours, you might not have time, and you definitely shouldn't rush. I think that's really the worst thing you can do with language acquisition. It cannot be rushed. It happens when it happens, and students need a lot of input for language acquisition to happen. So if you don't have a lot of contact hours, language acquisition is just going to be slower. So one idea would be to do level 1 kind of as a basic version, where you don't do any of the reader's theater, for example. And for the Grand series, we sometimes provide some variations, so you wouldn't do any of that, kind of really just a basic, straightforward version. You might shorten some elements or even leave out some of them, perhaps even only cover the first 2 or 3 themes. And then in first grade, you would review level 1, but expect more production here because they've already heard some of it. So there could be some fuller memorization of those elements. Students might memorize some of the Grand series and like even more of the reader's theater versions. You could perhaps do the first few themes kind of as an abbreviated version, just every other lesson or something like that, and then spend more time on the other themes that you haven't covered in kindergarten. And then you might do the same with the other levels, depending on the number of contact hours. If you're able to pick it up, you could at that point do a grade, but again, it's totally fine to spread this out over several grades. For students with only 2 or maybe even only 1 weekly lesson, you will definitely have to spread things out a little bit more. And So once again, you could have kinder and first grade both do level 1, like I was saying earlier, similarly. And then second grade would maybe have only the beginning, maybe themes 1 and 2 of level 2, or maybe even just 1.5. And then third grade would finish level 2 and might start level 3. I would, in that case, recommend doing no or very little grammar even in third grade, because if you have that little contact hours, it's really important to provide as much input as possible. And those grammar lessons, there's always going to be a lot of English involved, and that's always time that students don't hear and read Latin. So if you only have 1 or 2 weekly lessons, focus on providing as much input as you can during that time. And then fourth grade might finish up level 3. And so in fourth grade, you might include some grammar, just so that students can also start reflecting on the language itself and on how it functions. But again, both fourth and fifth grade, I would really recommend encouraging things that students can do at home. For example, would be to memorize or to practice reading fluently a Reader's Theatre version, or a grand series that they memorize and act out for a grade. So focus on things that provide input for students, that provide complete sentence Latin. Just a couple of points here about the student book. The student book is mostly meant for grades 3 and up because it has the grammar and writing elements in it. It also has all of the prayers, Bible verses, hymn songs, and the glossaries with translations. And it has the images for picture study if you want students to have them in front of them. And one thing that might be of interest to younger kids is the Grand Series boxes for student illustrations. We are going to put those on the website separately as well. So this is basically, I'll show you an example in a minute, like over here, where students have the sentences and then they draw their own illustration of what this means, of what's happening in these sentences. So that is something that even younger students can do as well. And that might be even something that could be an easy thing for a sub to do, for a sub lesson where you give them a few review glossaries to illustrate. And the student book also includes the Reader's Theatre versions of the storybooks and of some glossaries. You might not print the whole thing at this point for all of the students, even if you intend to use it, and just kind of play it by ear and see which elements you use, what you need to print, what you don't need to print. So these, I already mentioned these, they are helpful for students to do after they've been introduced to the story, so that they also practice reading them, and then they can illustrate them. And that is something that you could assign either for homework or, like I said, for a sub. I wouldn't recommend spending class time on it. That's why this is really not included as part of the lesson element, because that is time that students are not really hearing a lot of Latin. So it's something that they could do either at home or just for some additional reinforcement, or if you have to be out. A couple of words about the grammar extensions. So first of all, it's really important to remember that all students will learn a lot of grammar simply by being exposed to complete sentences all the time. Every sentence has grammar, so they are all learning grammar. The grammar extensions are really just to make the grammar that they've absorbed naturally more explicit, so that they can also reflect about it. With second graders, it can sometimes be helpful to just very, very briefly draw students' attention to how a word changes, even without doing an explicit grammar extension or grammar lesson. Like even in the very first Gone series, the word for dog is sometimes canis and sometimes camem, depending on how it is used in a sentence, depending on whether it's the subject or the direct object. So that's something that you can definitely draw students' attention to and make them listen for those endings and simply notice them. Notice, being aware of it, and gradually absorb that pattern, those patterns. The grammar extensions are not part of the general lesson time, so that would be something extra. With the older students, you can definitely leave out reviews and repetitions and make time. I'll show you an example in a minute, so that you don't really have to spend a lot of extra time on this. I would not recommend assigning these for homework, because if a student or a parent doesn't know what to do, then they get frustrated. This is something that I think is really helpful to do with guidance. And you also really don't have to do all of them, even if you decide to do them. You can pick and choose and maybe just do verbs, or just do nouns, or just do a little bit here and there. So you don't have to do all of them. You don't have to do everything. It's also really important that the main goal for grammar here is not to memorize forms, but to understand what they mean, to understand how a word functions in a sentence and how that is related to the way it looks and sounds differently. So we don't want students just memorizing isolated endings and syllables. We would like them to first understand what that means, what it means to have canis as opposed to canem, and to really understand how that functions in a sentence, as opposed to just memorizing those endings. So to make time for grammar extensions, again, you can leave things out, like some of the songs are reviewed a lot. The Grand Series are reviewed a lot, so you can leave out some of that, as long as you make sure that they're still being done regularly. And even the 4th and 5th graders should still do some of the songs, should still do the review Grand Series, so don't neglect those, please. We have an overview review chart on the website that you can download and look at. So here's just an example of how frequently these songs are repeated, and then how you could just decide, okay, we're not going to do this and that repetition. You can also just not plan it and just play it by ear and see how your students do and how much repetition they can tolerate. Again, with the storybooks, you could leave out some of the lessons. I would not recommend leaving out too many, because again, I mean, these provide so much good language for students, complete sentences, so much grammar. So that's something where I think really only if absolutely necessary, leave some out. Here's an example for what that might look like then. So you might, in the lesson, leave out some of the songs, like we have up here, the Christus Winkit and the Head Shoulders. You might leave out the review Grand Series, and the new Grand Series here is a variation, so it's not actually a fully new thing here. So it's something that just has some variation. So that could also be left out, and then you could make time that would give you enough time to do the optional grammar extension, which is based on this Grand Series that they've already seen. So here's an example of that Grand Series, which I think would probably take you about 7 minutes or so for students to work through this variation where they are putting in a different noun, and they have to decide whether that noun is going to be in the nominative as the subject of the sentence, or in the accusative as the direct object of the sentence. And they can choose to either do singular or plural. They can do just one animal or several. So that would be one example of making time for this. Also, level 1, theme 1, does not have any grammar extensions. We want students to really first just start out by being exposed to the language as a language and not as an analytical puzzle. So no grammar extensions on theme 1, but you could speed up theme 1 for older students, again by leaving out some of the reviews and repetitions, and then moving lesson elements from earlier, just making it go a little bit faster. And generally for 4th and 5th grade, I would recommend trying to keep lessons very fast-paced, so don't stop too frequently for explanations or other things. Just keep them on their toes, and remember that they still need a lot of repetition, even if they don't always want it. Also, don't explain anything that they can figure out for themselves. Always ask them first, well, what do you think? Or why do you think that is happening? Or what is happening here? Let them try to figure things out. And that also means don't translate things for them if they can demonstrate that they understand without translation. And just lastly, very briefly about vocabulary lists. which people often seem to think is a crucial element of a curriculum, we are very intentional about not providing vocabulary lists for students to memorize, because we really don't want students to memorize isolated words. We would like you to focus on sentences from the beginning, even if they're short, like the Grand series. Vocabulary really is best learned in context. Its words only mean when they appear in the context of a sentence. And students typically remember words so much better if they hear them in a sentence that is meaningful to them, that they can act out, that they can visualize, that they have a way to connect meaningfully to. So if you want them to memorize something, send those Grand series home, let them memorize those, let them memorize stanzas of a song, let them memorize maybe even the lines for Reader's Theatre. So definitely make them memorize things, just not in isolation, not isolated words. Always remember that the time that students spend using flashcards is time that they are not hearing or reading or processing full, complete language, meaningful language. Words in isolation are really a waste of time, and we don't want to waste our students' incredible linguistic potential on flashcards. We do have quizzes on the website that you can use. They are Word documents so that you can edit them. The quizzes really are quiz banks, not quizzes. There is a lot more on there than I think you should give to students, especially younger ones. Really important to remember that testing does not increase students' language acquisition. They should be motivated by an interesting lesson, not by the grades that they get on a quiz. So you could use these for as homework assignments, as additional worksheets, maybe even for a sub-lesson. You don't have to use these as quizzes. If you do use them as quizzes, be selective in what you put on them. It doesn't have to be something very lengthy. Ideally, a quiz should take maybe 5 or 10 minutes, no more than that. And I really want to encourage you to please ask anytime you have a question, anytime something is difficult. There's a very nice Facebook group with people very willing to help you out. A lot of both teachers and homeschoolers, a lot of people who started from scratch with zero Latin, who are willing to help you and answer your questions. So please always ask. Don't get frustrated. Ask questions.